Hey there, friends of YouTube. How you doing today? Sorry about the absenteeism this week. As I stated last week, I am on a vacation. Granted, it's a staycation. I haven't been really anywhere out of this house for feels like a million years, but that's okay. Couple of, you know, big, small things on the news. The first one is the Democratic Convention that has been going on. If you are unawares, tune in, or at least try and catch some of the speeches. I would highly recommend catching Michelle's if you didn't. It wasn't necessarily inspiring, but more heartfelt. And then tonight, we've got Obama and Biden speaking, which should be interesting. The other piece of news is that Massachusetts has made the flu vaccine mandatory. That is interesting, if only because I have already had to block and unfriend some people on Facebook because I was surrounded by anti-vaxxers. How fascinating. You know, people going, oh, well, I should move out of Massachusetts. Don't let the door hit you. Anyway, on we go. Chapter 11, The Only Currency. Fred Trump died on June 25th, 1999. The following day, his obituary was published in the New York Times under the banner, Fred C. Trump, post-war master builder of housing for middle class, dies at 93. The obituary writer made a point of contrasting Fred's status of a self-made man with his flamboyant son Donald. My grandfather's propensity for picking up unused nails at his construction sites to hand back to his carpenters the next day was noted before the details of his birth. The Times also repeated the family line that Donald had built his own business with minimal help from my grandfather, a small amount of money, a statement that the paper itself would refute 20 years later. We sat in the library, each with our own copy of the Times. Robert was raked over by the coals by his siblings for having told the Times that my grandfather's estate was worth between $250 and $300 million. Never, never give them numbers, Marianne lectured him as if he were a stupid kid. He stood there, shamefaced, cracking his knuckles and bouncing on the balls of his feet, just as my grandfather used to do, as if suddenly imagining the ensuing tax bill. The valuation was absurdly low. Eventually, we would learn that the empire was probably worth 4 times that. But Marianne and Donald would never have admitted that it was even that much. Later, we stood upstairs in the Madison Room at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the most exclusive and expensive bereavement service provider in the city. Smiling and shaking hands as a seemingly endless line of visitors passed through. Overall, more than 800 people moved through the rooms. Some were there to pay their respects, including rival real estate developers such as Sam LaFrac, New York Governor George Pataki, former Senator Al D'Amato, and comedian and future Celebrity Apprentice contestant Joan Rivers. The rest were most likely there to catch a glimpse of Donald. On the day of the funeral, Marble Collegiate Church was filled to capacity. During the service, from beginning to end, everybody had a role to play. It was all extremely well choreographed. Elizabeth read my grandfather's favorite poem, and the rest of the siblings gave eulogies, as did my brother, who spoke on behalf of my dad, and my cousin David, who represented the grandchildren. Mostly, they told stories about my grandfather. Although my brother was the only one who came close to humanizing him for the most part, in ways both oblique and direct, the emphasis was on my grandfather's material success, his killer instinct, and his talent for saving a buck. Donald was the only one to deviate from the script. In a cringe-inducing turn, his eulogy devolved into a paean to his own great. It was so embarrassing that Marianne later told her son not to allow any of her siblings to speak at her funeral. Rudolph Giuliani, New York City's mayor at the time, also spoke. When the service was over, the 6 oldest grandchildren, Tiffany was too young, accompanied the casket to the hearse as honorary pallbearers, which meant, as was often the case in our family, that others did the heavy lifting while we got the credit. All of the streets from 5th Avenue and 45th Street to the Midtown Tunnel, more than 16 blocks away, had been closed to cars and pedestrians, so our motorcade, with a police escort, slid easily out of the city. It was a quick trip to All Faiths Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, for the burial. We drove back to the city just as quickly, but with less fanfare, for lunch at Donald's apartment. Afterward, I accompanied my grandmother back to the house. The 2 of us sat in the library and chatted for a while. She seemed tired but relieved. It had been a very long day, a very long few years, actually. Other than the live-in maid, who was asleep upstairs, it was just the 2 of us. I was supposed to be on my honeymoon. I stayed with her until she was ready to go to bed. When she said she was ready for bed, I asked her if she wanted me to stay or if there was anything I could get for her before I left. "No, dear, I'm fine." I bent over to kiss her cheek. She smelled like vanilla. "You are my favorite person," I told her. It wasn't true, but I said it because I loved her. I said it, too, because nobody else had bothered to stay with her after her husband of 63 years had been put in the ground. "Good," she replied. "I should be." And then I left her alone in that large, quiet, empty house. 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I was home when a DHL truck pulled up to deliver a large yellow envelope containing a copy of my grandfather's will. I read through it twice to be sure I hadn't misunderstood anything. I had promised my brother I'd call him as soon as I knew anything, but I was reluctant to do so. Fritz and Lisa's 3rd child, William, had been born hours after my grandfather's funeral. 24 hours after that, he'd begun having seizures. He had been in the neonatal intensive care unit ever since. They had 2 young children at home, and Fritz had to work. I had no idea how they were managing all of it. I hated to be the bearer of more bad news, but he needed to know, so I called him. "So what's the deal?" he asked. "Nothing," I told him. "We got nothing." A few days later, I got a call from Rob. As far as I could remember, he had only ever called me before to let me know when Gam was in the hospital. He acted as if everything were fine. If I signed off on the will, he implied everything would be great. And he did need my signature in order for the will to be released for probate. Though it's true that my grandfather disinherited me and my brother, that is, instead of splitting what could have been my father's 20% share of his estate between me and my brother, he had divided it evenly among his 4 other children. We were included in a bequest made separately to all of the grandchildren, an amount that proved to be less than 0.1% of what my aunts and uncles had inherited. In the context of the entire estate, it was a very small amount of money, and it must have infuriated Robert that it gave me and Fritz the power to hold up the distribution of the assets. Days passed. I couldn't bring myself to sign. In the breadth and concision of its cruelty, the will was a stunning document that very much resembled my parents' divorce agreement. For a while, Robert called me every day. Mary Ann and Donald had assigned him to be the point person. Donald didn't want to be bothered, and Mary Ann's husband, John, had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and his prognosis was not good. "Cash in your chips, honey bunch," Rob said repeatedly, as if that would make me forget what was in the will. No matter how many times he said it, though, my brother and I had agreed not to sign anything until we had some idea of what our options were. Eventually, Rob began to lose patience. Fritz and I were holding everything up. The will couldn't go to probate until all of the beneficiaries had signed off. When I told Rob that Fritz and I weren't yet willing to take that step, he suggested we get together to discuss it. At our first meeting, when we asked Rob to explain why my grandfather had done what he'd done, Rob said, "Listen, your grandfather didn't give a shit about you. And not just you, he didn't give a shit about any of his grandchildren." "We're being treated worse because our father died," I said. "No, not at all." When we pointed out that our cousins would still benefit from what their parents were getting from my grandfather, Rob said any of them could be disowned at any time. Donnie was going to join the army or some shit like that, and Donald and Ivana told him that if he did, they'd disown him in a second. Our father didn't have that luxury, I said. Rob sat back. I could see him trying to recalibrate. It's pretty simple, he said. As far as your grandfather was concerned, dead is dead. He only cared about his living children. I wanted to point out that my grandfather hadn't cared about Rob either, but Fritz intervened. Rob, he said, this just isn't fair. I lost track of how many meetings the three of us had between July and October 1999. There was a brief respite in September while I was in Hawaii for my postponed wedding and honeymoon. At the very beginning of our discussions, Fritz, Robert, and I agreed that we would leave Gam out of it. I assumed she had no idea how we'd been treated in my grandfather's will and saw no reason to upset her. Hopefully, we would be able to resolve everything and she'd never have to know there had been a problem at all. I spoke to her every day while I was away, and once, back in New York, resumed my visits to her. The negotiations, if they could even be called that, also resumed. There was a numbing sameness to our conversations. No matter what Fritz and I said, Rob came back with his cliches and canned responses. We all remained at a standstill. I asked him about Midland Associates, the management company my grandfather had set up decades earlier in order to avoid paying certain taxes and benefits his children. Midland owned a group of 7 buildings, including Sunnyside Towers and the Highlander, that were referred to in my family as the mini-empire. I knew very little about it. None of my trustees had ever explained what role it played or how money was generated, but I received a check every few months. We wanted to know how or if my grandfather's death would affect the partnership going forward. We weren't asking for a specific dollar amount or a percentage of the estate, just some assurance that the assets we already had would be secure in the future, and if, given the family's enormous wealth, there was anything they could see their way clear to doing as far as my grandfather's estate was concerned. As the executors and, along with Elizabeth, sole beneficiaries, Mary Ann, Donald, and Robert had a wide latitude in that area, but Rob remained non-committal. At our final meeting in the bar of the Drake Hotel on 56th Street and Park Avenue, it was clear that Robert had begun to understand that we weren't going to back down. Prior to that, despite the unpleasant things he'd been saying to us, he had maintained an affable, "Hey kids, I'm just here as a messenger" attitude. That day he reminded us once again that my grandfather had hated our mother and had been afraid his money would fall into her hands. That was laughable because for more than 25 years my mother had lived according to the terms the Trumps had set, following their directions to the letter. She had lived in the same poorly maintained apartment in Jamaica, Queens. Her alimony and child support payments had rarely increased. Yet she had never asked for more. Finally, Fred had disowned us because he could. The people who'd been assigned to protect us, at least financially, were our trustees, Mary Ann, Donald, Robert, and Erwin Durbin. But they apparently had no interest in protecting us, especially at their own expense. Rob leaned forward, suddenly serious. "Listen, if you don't sign this will, if you think of suing us, we will bankrupt Midland Associates, and you'll be paying taxes on money you don't have for the rest of your lives." There was nothing left to say after that. Either Fritz and I gave in or we fought. Neither option was a good one. We consulted with Erwin, who felt like the only ally we had left. He was incensed about how poorly our grandfather had treated us in the will. When we told him how Robert had responded, when asked about Midland Associates and our share in other Trump entities, he said, "Your share of the ground leases under Shorehaven and Beach Haven alone are priceless. If they're not going to do anything for you, you're going to have to sue them." I had no idea what a ground lease was, let alone that I had a share in 2 of them, but I knew what priceless meant, and I trusted Erwin. Based on his recommendations, Fritz and I made a decision. After all those months, William was still in the hospital, and Fritz and Lisa were feeling overwhelmed. I told him I'd take care of it and called Rob that afternoon. "Is there anything you guys can do, Rob?" I asked. "Sign the will and we'll see." "Really?" "Your father's dead," he said. "I know he's dead, Rob, but we're not." I was sick of having this conversation. He paused. "Mary Ann, Donald, and I are simply following Dad's wishes. Your grandfather didn't want you or Fritz, or especially your mother, to get anything." I took a deep breath. This is going nowhere, I said. Fritz and I are going to hire an attorney. As if a switch had been flipped, Robert screamed, "You do whatever the fuck you need to do," and slammed the phone down. The next day, there was a message from Gam on my answering machine when I got home. "Mary, this is your grandmother," she said tersely. She never referred to herself that way. It was always Gam. I called her back right away. "Your Uncle Robert tells me you and your brother are suing for 20% of your grandfather's estate." I felt blindsided and said nothing right away. Obviously, Rob had broken our agreement and told my grandmother his version of what we'd been discussing. But the other thing that held me up was that my grandmother spoke as if our getting what would have been my father's share of the estate was somehow wrong and unseemly. I was confused. About loyalty, about love, about the limits of both. I'd thought I was part of the family. I'd gotten it all wrong. "Gam, we haven't asked for anything. I don't know what Rob was telling you, but we're not suing anybody." "You'd better not be." "We're just trying to figure this out, that's all." "Do you know what your father was worth when he died?" She said, "A whole lot of nothing." There was a pause and then a click. She'd hung up on me. All right, folks. That was Chapter 11, The Only Currency. I will not promise that tomorrow will bring around Chapter 12. But we'll see. Anyway, have fun out there, stay sane, and avoid the news. Bye now.